Keanu Reeves lived in the kind of house people barely noticed. It wasn't the biggest on the street, nor the newest. No marble driveway, no security gate, no flashy lights glowing through oversized windows. Just a modest, well-kept home tucked neatly between two louder, prouder houses that seemed to compete for attention. Every morning, he left early, often on his old motorcycle, the engine's soft rumble disappearing before most people even opened their curtains. To the neighborhood, he was just another resident, quiet, private, and easily forgettable. In a community ruled by a strict homeowners association, that kind of simplicity stood out. The HOA loved order, appearances, and control. Lawns had to be cut to a precise height. Trash bins couldn't be visible after sunset. Exterior paint shades were approved down to the smallest detail. Most residents followed the rules out of fear of fines or public shaming. Keanu followed them too. Not because he feared consequences, but because he respected shared space. He never argued, never complained, never attended meetings. That alone made some board members uneasy. The neighbors had their own theories about him. Some thought he was retired. Others assumed he worked from home, maybe something in tech. A few whispered that he was odd for choosing such a simple life when he clearly didn't need to. He wore the same jackets year after year. He waved politely but never lingered in conversation. When asked about his work, he'd smile and change the subject. In a neighborhood obsessed with status, his lack of explanation felt almost suspicious. Yet, there were small moments that didn't go unnoticed. He helped an elderly man fix a broken fence without being asked. He shoveled snow from the sidewalks long before the sun came up. Once, during a summer blackout affecting another street, he quietly delivered bottled water and candles door to door. He never posted about it, never mentioned it. If someone thanked him, he'd simply nod, as if kindness were an inconvenience rather than a virtue. Still, the HOA board didn't see generosity, they saw non-participation. To them, Keanu Reeves wasn't a model resident. He didn't attend community barbecues. He didn't donate publicly to neighborhood drives. He didn't clap loudly during meetings or flatter the board's authority. And in a system built on control, silence can feel like defiance. The HOA president once glanced at his house during a routine drive-through and muttered, "That one's too quiet." In that moment, a simple truth was overlooked. Some people don't need attention to matter. And some storms begin not with noise, but with someone deciding that quiet is a threat. The morning started like any other in the neighborhood, calm and ordinary. But tension was building behind the closed doors of the HOA office. The board had been discussing Keanu Reeves for weeks, though none of them had personally interacted with him. To them, he was an anomaly, a quiet, private man who didn't play by their unspoken rules of participation and visibility. At the latest meeting, the discussion had grown heated. One board member slammed a folder full of paperwork onto the table. "He's in violation of community compliance," she said, her voice sharp and final. "Electrical modifications without approval. Unanswered emails. Ignoring fines." The others nodded, eager to act, their indignation fueled by a mixture of authority and irritation at his refusal to conform. It didn't take long for them to make a decision. The vote was unanimous, though several members admitted later that they hadn't even read all the documents. To them, Keanu's compliance, or lack thereof, was secondary to sending a message. The HOA president, a tall, imposing man with a reputation for strict enforcement, smiled grimly as he signed the order. The plan was simple: cut the power to Keanu's house. No warnings, no second chances, no inspection. Just swift action to remind the neighborhood who was in control. In their eyes, it was routine, a standard measure, an administrative correction. To Keanu, it would be life-changing. By mid-morning, the crew arrived, black uniforms and dark vans, tools clanging as they moved toward the unsuspecting house. Neighbors peeked from windows and porches, curious but cautious, watching as the crew worked in silence. One of the younger board members, standing nearby, whispered, "This is going to show him." The others nodded, proud of their decisive action. They didn't realize the statement they were making wasn't about obedience. It was about underestimating a man who had never needed validation. They saw only compliance and defiance, rules and punishment, never character or intent. When the lights went out in Keanu's home, the streets seemed to pause. The hum of air conditioners ceased. The soft glow of lamps disappeared. For a brief moment, the quietest house in the neighborhood became the center of attention. The HOA had expected resistance, complaints, perhaps even confrontation. Instead, there was only stillness. Keanu sat in the dark, quietly observing the rain streaking the windows, the shadows in the corners of the room. No anger, no calls, no threats. He simply acknowledged the inconvenience and continued on with his morning, a small ritual of coffee and a glance at the old motorcycle parked neatly in the driveway. By the time the HOA president called for a status update from the crew, the situation was already beginning to shift in ways they hadn't anticipated. Keanu's calmness wasn't indifference, it was strength. While the board believed they were asserting authority, they were unknowingly stepping into a story far larger than their rules. Their attempt to enforce power through punishment was about to collide with a quiet resilience they couldn't comprehend. And on that ordinary morning, as the rain fell softly on the darkened house, the stage was set, not for confrontation, but for revelation. The neighborhood was about to learn that power is not always about control, and quiet can sometimes speak louder than a storm. Darkness had settled over Keanu Reeves' house like a velvet curtain. The electricity was gone. No soft hum of lights, no whirring appliances, no buzzing electronics. Outside, the neighborhood carried on as usual, unaware that the quiet man in the modest home had been plunged into sudden isolation. But inside, Keanu moved calmly, his footsteps soft against the wooden floors. He lit a few candles, their warm glow reflecting off the walls, creating small pools of light in the otherwise dark space. The power cut could have been frustrating, even humiliating, yet there was no trace of anger on his face. Instead, there was focus, an unshakable calm that made it clear he wasn't powerless. Even in the dim candlelight, Keanu noticed the familiar rhythm of his surroundings. The rain tapped against the windows, a soothing backdrop to the quiet house. He prepared a small breakfast, the flicker of the flame illuminating each simple action, each deliberate motion. No shouting, no complaints. He knew that anger would accomplish nothing here. The HOA thought they could assert control with darkness, with inconvenience, with fear. What they didn't understand was that real strength often shows itself in silence, patience, and presence. He had lived long enough to know that reacting impulsively rarely changes outcomes. Then, a soft whine caught his attention. A neighbor's dog, frightened by the storm, had slipped through a partially open gate and wandered into his yard. Keanu knelt, allowing the small creature to approach. He wrapped it gently in a towel and guided it to a safe corner near the candles, offering comfort without expectation. Soon after, he noticed the faint glow of a flashlight through the misted windows of another home. An elderly neighbor, ill and alone, struggled to navigate the darkened path to her door. Without hesitation, Keanu grabbed his own flashlight and escorted her safely inside, checking to make sure she had blankets and water. To the HOA, he might have seemed weak in the absence of electricity, but to those who needed help, he was anything but. By the time the sun began to rise, the house remained dark and quiet, yet the energy within it was unmistakable. Keanu didn't post on social media or notify anyone of the inconvenience. He didn't call the HOA to complain or demand restitution. He simply adapted, using what he had to assist others, to maintain calm, and to continue life on his own terms. The power outage was meant to assert dominance, to embarrass him, to make him a spectacle for the neighborhood. Instead, it revealed his quiet resilience. The board had assumed that compliance would be coerced through discomfort, but true character cannot be forced. As neighbors began their day, some peering curiously at the darkened home, others whispering among themselves, the first seeds of doubt were planted. Who was this man, sitting silently in darkness, yet so clearly unshaken? The HOA had attempted to punish him, to make a statement of authority, but the quiet acts of kindness unfolding in the shadows were more powerful than any rules, fines, or lights. And in that moment, it became clear. While they controlled the power lines, they had no control over his influence, his integrity, or the unseen strength that made him quietly unstoppable. While the neighborhood went about its morning routine, unaware of the quiet drama unfolding, the truth behind the HOA's actions began to surface. Inside the board's office, tension hung thick in the air, heavier than the stacks of paperwork cluttering the desks. The president, who had ordered the power cut, was scrolling through files on his computer, his confident smile fading as he realized he had underestimated the consequences. Keanu Reeves' house wasn't just some ordinary residence. It had been upgraded with solar panels, a backup generator, and an advanced energy monitoring system. What the HOA had intended as a simple punishment, a power outage to assert dominance, was about to expose their own hidden misdeeds. For weeks, the HOA had funneled funds into inflated repair projects, overpriced contractors, and fake invoices. The power lines that were modified without approval. In reality, they were inspected and fully compliant. The HOA's motives were no longer about enforcing community rules. They were about fear and control. Someone in the neighborhood had finally tipped off an investigative reporter, and documents proving the corruption were quietly circulating, ready to be discovered. Keanu's quiet house, with its self-sufficient systems, had become a beacon, unintentionally drawing attention to the misdeeds of those who had believed themselves untouchable. Meanwhile, Keanu remained calm, as if he had anticipated this revelation long before it came. He didn't call lawyers or make public statements. Instead, he picked up the phone and made a single, deliberate call to a trusted friend with connections to regulatory authorities. His words were concise, factual, and completely devoid of emotion, yet the weight behind them was undeniable. Within hours, investigators were mobilized, quietly heading toward the HOA offices. To the president and his board, everything seemed normal, until documents began disappearing from their files, employees were questioned, and the foundation of their authority started to crumble. The very action meant to humiliate Keanu had now set in motion the undoing of those who sought to control him. The irony wasn't lost on the few neighbors who began to notice. The man who had been powerless in the eyes of the HOA had never truly been so. While the board had imagined themselves wielding control over his home and, by extension, his life, they had ignored the strength that comes from character, preparation, and quiet influence. Keanu's silence, patience, and simple adherence to integrity had become a force more powerful than their arbitrary rules. The neighborhood, once oblivious to the corruption simmering behind closed doors, began to sense a shift. Whispers grew into cautious discussions, questions were asked, and doubt crept into the minds of those who had once blindly supported the HOA's actions. By the afternoon, the investigators arrived at the HOA office. Files were reviewed, funds traced, and mismanagement documented. The president's smug confidence had vanished, replaced by anxious explanations and stammered denials. In the quiet, methodical exposure of wrongdoing, the neighborhood witnessed a truth that was impossible to ignore. Keanu Reeves, the quiet man in the darkened house, had already won. The power outage that had been meant to humiliate him had instead illuminated a much larger story, revealing not weakness, but wisdom, not anger, but influence, and not defeat, but a subtle, unstoppable form of justice. The balance had shifted, and the HOA would never see the neighborhood the same way again. By the evening, the neighborhood had changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. The power in Keanu Reeves' house had been restored, not by the HOA, but through quiet intervention from authorities and the support of neighbors who had finally realized the truth. The house glowed once more, warm light spilling onto the driveway, reflecting off the wet pavement from the morning rain. But it wasn't just the lights that illuminated the space, it was the revelation of character, integrity, and quiet power. Keanu had endured the inconvenience, the public scrutiny, and the arrogance of the HOA without complaint, demonstrating a kind of resilience that few could comprehend. The HOA president and board members, once brimming with authority and certainty, were now humbled. Their attempts to control and punish had backfired spectacularly. Files had been examined, accounts traced, and mismanagement exposed. The community that had once viewed Keanu as a quiet, perhaps inconsequential figure, began to see him in a new light. He wasn't just a man who lived modestly. He was someone who, through patience, preparation, and quiet action, had revealed truths the neighborhood never expected. And though Keanu never sought recognition, the impact of his calm, steady approach was undeniable. In the days that followed, small but meaningful changes began to take place. Keanu used the settlement funds from the HOA's fines not to enrich himself, but to improve the lives of those around him. Solar panels were installed to benefit the community during outages, elderly residents received assistance with bills and essential needs, and public spaces were quietly refurbished without fanfare. Neighbors who had once whispered judgments now nodded respectfully, acknowledging that this was a man who acted not out of ego, but from a place of genuine compassion. The neighborhood had learned a powerful lesson. Influence is not measured by noise, anger, or power over others. It is measured by quiet deeds, patience, and the courage to do what is right, even when unnoticed. Keanu himself never attended another HOA meeting, never appeared in the local news, and never issued statements of triumph. He remained as he had always been, modest, kind, and quietly attentive to the needs of those around him. To the neighborhood, he was more than a resident. He had become an example of integrity, a reminder that character speaks louder than rules, and that true power often goes unseen. The HOA's downfall was complete, but the most profound change was internal. The realization among residents that respect is earned not through fear or dominance, but through consistent, unassuming virtue. As the sun set over the quiet suburban street, the soft glow of Keanu's home stood as a symbol. The man they tried to intimidate had turned adversity into strength, punishment into opportunity, and silence into a profound message. The HOA had underestimated him, but the neighborhood would never forget. In the end, they had tried to cut his power, unaware that real strength comes not from control over others, but from who you are when no one is watching. And in that calm, unassuming house, with its restored lights and quiet hero at its center, the truth was clear. The man they thought powerless had always been unstoppable.